is able to come and watch us live right now, we are here with Franki Bagdade, and she just has a list of things that she has accomplished. Let's see, I have a whole paper. She's a master's level educator. She is a clinical social worker. She's a public speaker and author, and I'm sure there's just more. But we're so grateful to have you. You're also owner of FAAB Consulting and Franki Bagdade's Therapy, which I'm sure you'll talk about. We're just excited. Betsy, on behalf of me and Betsy, Executive Director of Hope for HIE, we're so grateful you could talk to us about summer camp experiences and just how inclusive they can be for our range of, HIE people in our community. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me today.
Of course. I would love if you could just start by providing us with just a career overview and just an explanation of how maybe FAAB consulting or your therapy practice came to be.
Absolutely. So whenever I hear my bio read back to me, it's very validating. I'm like, oh, that's why I'm so tired. Okay, now I get it, right? Like just doing too many things.
It makes sense.
Right, like all the parents I'm sure on here, like wear so many hats, parenting being a big one, right? And it's been so exciting to watch the journey with this amazing organization. So I'm excited to be a small part of it. Okay, so how did I get here? So I started out as a graduate in elementary education, and it was a different time in Michigan. Like getting an elementary education job was totally impossible then. Funny, right? And so
now we need them.
Right. So I really accidentally fell into special education because there was a wonderful private school, which we are connected to.
We are connected through that.
Right? And, just such a funny thing. I was at a big job fair and I saw Birmingham, Michigan, and I was literally like, oh, that's close by and there's no line, honestly. And I connected so much with the founder of the school. She was there doing interviews at that time, and I loved their mission. And they're like, we're going to train you. And I was like, awesome, I want to learn. And it was one of those things that was just so meant to be from my first day in the classroom, working with kids with different learning challenges. It was such a good fit. And in so many ways, I felt like I got to re-educate myself, right? I struggled as a student in so many ways that I felt like weren't recognized. I loved teaching math because I never in my life understood math. So it was like this privilege to help kids get it. So that's where my, entree to special education happened. I went on to work in another private school and fell into teacher consulting, which I loved. And somehow, the connection to mental health and behavior, it all came together. I was often in a nonprofit or a private school that had limited resources. And so I started to wear many hats, even without that technical social worker degree, and started being really fascinated by behavior. When a child was acting out, so to speak, I knew it was telling a story, and it wasn't something that necessarily needed a consequence. We needed to figure out what's going on. The camp I grew up at started to look for somebody to run their inclusion program in 2015. And I jumped at that chance. I'm like, this is perfect. I get camp, I get, to be part of an inclusion movement. And it was a really interesting time in camping, probably way too late. That all of a sudden inclusion was the thing in 2015, oh my goodness, decades too late. And actually in the Jewish camping world, because overnight camp is very tied into that culture, there started to be lots of cool grant opportunities and momentum and the inclusion movement. And I had so many opportunities to train and go look at other camps and help take a small program and build it and figure out how to say yes more to accommodating different types of needs at camp. And it's just been such a privilege. So in 2019, I was laid off, and it's one of those stories you hear from other people. At the time, it feels like the worst thing ever, and then it ends up being the best thing in some ways. And I just couldn't find what I wanted out there professionally. So I made it myself, and I started this consulting company. 3 years ago, we went through a pandemic like everyone else, so it's had its twists and turns. But through it all, I've been able to speak and train educators, camp staff, camp professionals, and mental health professionals in neurodiversity and in inclusion.
And we are just ready to start talking about how to find the perfect summer camp experience. And it's crazy that it's February and that we have to start thinking about this already. Isn't that insane?
It is insane. And when I worked for an overnight camp, one of my big roles was recruitment. And I felt like mean when I was calling people in October, because we opened registration in September, and it was like, what are you thinking about summer? And they're like, Frankie, we're still trying to figure out the beginning of the school year. What is your problem? But it is the reality. And I'm sure a lot of parents here, they're months into this process.
Yeah. I mean, I'm even thinking about like my own trying to find like school experiences and daycare and stuff for my kid. And she's 3.5, and you have to start with a year in advance. So like no pressure to families, but I guess now's a great time to start doing this work, right?
It absolutely is.
And you're the expert, so we're just going to rely on you. So here we go. So I know you've mentioned this in your kind of bio before, but you created so many resources for families that speak to the benefits of overnight camp experiences, finding the right experience for your child. And when it comes to the Hope for HIE community, as I'm sure you know, we just represent a wide variety of kids, from those developing typically to those with more identified disabilities and differences. So knowing that range of outcomes with our community, as a parent, where do I start looking to sign up my child for summer camp experience? How do I even begin that process?
So there's a couple places if you really like to start. A lot of times I think people tend to start with a camp they've heard of, or if you are a camp alum yourself, you may want to start, in a place that's near and dear to your heart. But a great place to start, and I was just, looking at their site last night, is the American Camp Association. You want an accredited camp because that process is strict and a challenge. I've been on both sides, and it's important. So you can look there. They actually have a great search tool, and even you can even specifically look at a disability that you're wondering if a camp can accommodate. So they've actually refined it lately. I was really impressed. So you could start there. And being in Michigan, I always think some people are using camps in Canada and they have their own accreditation process. So I believe it's by province. So there's like an Ontario Camp Association. The only caveat in time where you may be at a camp that has lots of licensing but isn't part of ACA is some of the daycares and like district camps, they're regulated as a school. So still lots of standards and things in place. But you want, a licensed camp in some ways. So that's a good place to start. And then to sort of ask your, circle of parent friends for some real feedback, knowing that, everybody's needs are different. And sometimes people's goals for camp are different as well. So all of that is important to consider.
So in terms of like ensuring the validity or reliability of that camp and their ability to offer support or opportunities for our kids, that's where you recommend is that American Camp Association, because you know that if it's on there, it's going to be licensed. And
yes,
ready.
It's going to be licensed. Yeah. Okay. It doesn't necessarily, unfortunately, mean that they're handling inclusion in a way that I would hope. Right. But yes, we know that it's licensed, and that talks about like staff to camper ratio and all kinds of like safety things that we definitely would want in place.
Cool. And I know just in doing some research, because you have a lot of blogs on this topic as well, you have mentioned before something called choice programming. And I'm wondering if you could define what that is and how I know if a summer camp offers that.
Yeah, so there's lots of different kinds of camps. So the camp I worked at was what I would call like an all-around camp, where the kids were going to programming with their cabin mates. So that meant that sometime like now, that camp is sitting with their databases and scheduling. And knowing that, bunk 2, unit 4 is going to have arts and crafts at 10 a.m. on July 4th. And there may be like a little bit of choice here and there, but it's mostly the idea of that camp is let's expose kids to all kinds of different things, to activities they might not know that they love. And there's definitely so much value in it. I saw it when I worked there. There are kids who really do better, though, with more autonomy and choice for so many reasons. And there's camps like the one that one of my kids goes to now, where the first day they have like their little note card and they're walking around and making their own schedule and signing up for what they want to do, and building their own camp experience. And then there's many camps that have a half and half, where everybody who's in 3rd grade is going to go swimming at this time, but then in the afternoon, here's 4 choices. So if you go on a camp's website, most of them will have like a snapshot of the day or a sample schedule, and that will give you some idea of where, if they do incorporate choice, they would do that.
Wonderful. I mean, yeah, and as you know, with our teacher background as well, it's all about choice, isn't it?
Right. It's
right?
true. Right.
Yeah. And they're just giving them that ownership and autonomy to make those decisions themselves, I think is just a great experience for kids.
Yes. And even if you choose a camp that's more all around and there's so much value to it, one of the questions I was asked a lot when I was doing recruitment is, what happens if my child doesn't want to do an activity? And I think that's a really important question to ask. And I think it's an important answer to hear, because you want it handled in a really respectful way. There's lots of reasons why kids don't want to do activities, and they really matter. It's not a kid being difficult. I mean, are kids difficult sometimes? Yeah, of course. But often it's not. That's way too simplistic. There can be so many things. Maybe they aren't as coordinated and they don't want to play a team sport because they've had bad experiences. So, my answer when I was working as a camp professional is, we would never force a child to do an activity. We will ask questions, to try to figure out maybe why they don't want to do it. And then like really respectful encouragement, like a counselor saying, hey, let's do it together. But that ultimately it's a kid's choice. So I find that that's a question that will give you some information and just like how they handle certain things, normal childhood things, right?
At a
camp.
Yeah, that's a brilliant question to ask, because that's probably an inevitable situation at one point in time, and it's so important to ascertain how they're going to react to that. So that's
right,
really
absolutely.
telling. Yeah. So more important questions to ask, really, once a parent has found a camp or has at least narrowed down their options to a few that they're interested in, what are other important questions to ask them during that vetting process? So I know you just mentioned like what happens when my kid doesn't want to be part of an activity. What are some other things that may come to mind?
Yeah, so here's some things get really individual. So if you have a child with complex medical needs, then I would spend a lot of time asking how they would accommodate, or if they will accommodate. Unfortunately, it's not always, a when or how. So camps really vary in terms of how they handle medical needs at camp. Many camps have a doctor on camp all the time, and nurses. Many camps don't. They might have a nurse, and then, maybe they're very close to an urgent care that they work with, or a hospital or a clinic or a town. So that's how they handle things. And depending on what your child's medical needs are, that may or may not be appropriate. So that's a good thing for sure to ask, and what it would look like if they're able to support your child's medical needs. So does that mean that there's always, 2 counselors with the group of 12 kids, so someone can, a staff member could walk away with their child if something were to come up and they needed support quickly? Would your child have a dedicated staff? There's all different models, and I would definitely ask a lot of questions about that. If you have a child who needs support socially, what does that look like? Behaviorally, I like to know if they have a mental health professional on campus, at camp. Even honestly, if it's not the place I think my child would need support, there are so many kids that will. So it will affect my kids no matter what. That's something that's changed a ton in the overnight camp world in the last decade. Whereas a lot of camps felt like they could get away with like somebody on call, and now they're saying the needs are just too intense nowadays and they need somebody at camp. It used to be maybe we'll have somebody from the city come in 9 to 5. Well, guess what? Overnight camp is 24 hours a day. So thankfully, there's been a lot of great grant funding out there, and camps are able now, many of them, to put somebody on staff.
Yeah. From a parent perspective, if I were to send my kid to a camp, I mean, my own anxiety aside, what does communication maybe look like? Is that a question that's an important one to ask when interviewing or vetting for these experiences? Like, how often can I speak to my child and the processes behind that?
Yeah, that's definitely a very important question. And it's really twofold. It's how you could communicate with your kid and how you could communicate with the camp. And camps have lots of different ways they do that. Some camps have like a parent liaison whose job it is to take the phone call, to maybe get answers to questions and come back to you. Sometimes they're talking directly to a director or a unit head. Those would all be great questions. Does a director or unit head check their email? If my child's getting support, am I talking to a support person and not going through like the regular child liaison, parent liaison process? Those are great questions. In terms of how kids communicate, the vast majority of camps are really old school and traditional, and they're relying on letters, which is kind of cool. And sometimes for parents, it's like, what? We learned that the mail system is really slow. So sometimes it can be a challenge. Something like really funny I saw at my camp that happens all over is many of these camps are very remotely located. And they have little post offices for their little towns. And all of a sudden there's like 500 extra kids there and an onslaught of letters. And honestly, they get processed slowly. Those are just good questions. Some camps have gone to like a scanning system of letters. So you can sort of in real time communicate with your child. Most camps don't want kids calling home because they find it really does get in the way of sort of recovering and acclimating from like homesickness, which, we expect like an adjustment. There were definitely kids that I worked with when I worked at camp that really benefited from a call home strategically once in a while. And honestly, it was something that I had a hard time coming around to as a professional, because it seemed a little overwhelming. Like, what if they do get homesick? But I learned, like I've learned a million times over again, that individual child, individual needs, individual things that work. So it's a good place to see how flexible a camp is, and you really want a camp that honors you as the expert of your kid. And if you stay to that camp, I really think my child's going to have to hear my voice once in 2 weeks. Like, I would hope they would at least have a good conversation about that. They might say, well, I disagree and here's why. Okay, like that, at least it's a conversation. But if they're just shutting it down, are they really truly listening to what you know about your child's needs?
Yeah. So, I mean, a lot of this when trying to find experience for your kids is really probably going with your parental gut too, and just using your
like
best
everything,
judgment,
right?
with everything.
Yeah.
And and in my case, it's probably always like wrong, but like that's okay.
No. Yeah, it for sure is. Yeah. And honestly, like I feel the camps should spend the time with you that you need. It's part of their jobs. Like, they're serving parents just as much as campers. And listen, I spent a lot of time talking to some parents who needed my support because they were anxious about sending their child away. And sometimes those kids didn't have much support needs in the summer, but the parents did. And we're serving families. I felt that was my
Right.
responsibility.
Right. That's a huge part. I mean, it's not just an experience from the kid's perspective. This is something that the parents have to go through too. Yeah.
Absolutely. It's a lot of
Yeah.
trust. I mean, I get it.
Oh, it's so much trust. I mean, I can't even find a babysitter. My parents live 3 hours away, and I still drive them halfway.
Oh, yes,
So it is.
yes.
It's a big decision. So I think just like
Mhm.
that level of comfort is just a huge component to
Yes.
this.
Mhm.
And that if something doesn't sit right, to either talk about it, engage in that conversation with them, and either find a solution or say maybe there's another experience that is
Yeah.
better. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
How do you determine the size of the camp? Do they typically publicize that like on a website, or is that more of a conversation with like the camp director?
Yeah, sometimes you can get a feel from the website. I mean, some camps are really proud of their size, so they may say
Yeah,
something, or you
yeah.
may just, hear around town. And I don't necessarily think like big is less specialized or less individualized.
Mhm,
It really depends. So there are a lot of bigger camp programs that were really pioneers in terms of, including more kids with more needs because they were bigger and therefore had more funding and had more resources and more physical space. So sometimes that is the answer. And then, there's also something nice about a camp that gets, 100 kids, 150 kids max during a session.
mm,
And the little kids know the bigger kids and the staff knows
mm,
everyone's name, and it's like a whole different community feeling. So for
mhm.
sure, pluses and minuses to both situations.
Yeah. Do you feel like, because you've talked about how they're going to support medical needs, social needs, behavioral needs, and communication, do you think there's any other pillar or important conversation piece that a parent should ask that we haven't discussed yet when it comes to vetting for a summer camp experience?
I'm always, if a camp has a decent website, and I say that
Mm,
because some small camps just, their websites are not super robust, and I wouldn't want to necessarily like throw them out of the running for a camp just because of that.
right.
But if they do have a decent website, with lots of them have, I want to look, I want to see like something on there, like inclusion, special
Mm,
needs. I mean, the language may not be what you prefer, but something on there, disability accommodations that shows that it is a priority and it's something that they're thinking about and everything. I
mhm,
think that's important. If it's not there, then I would sort of wonder why. Um, and ask a general question like,
yeah.
how do you approach a child who needs support? Do you have other campers with autism? What does that look like?
Mhm,
So camps handle things in so many different ways. There are camps who have like inclusion programs, and they are sometimes called like one-on-ones or shadows or aides. And that's their model, where if a camper has higher needs, they're going to put an extra staff in the cabin that is trained differently
mhm,
and be the eyes and ears for that camper. I've talked to other camps who feel like every counselor should be an inclusion counselor, and we may put an extra staff in there, but everybody should be working with everyone. So that's a different way of looking at it. Even when I was running an inclusion program, we had campers who were in the inclusion program and campers who weren't, because they didn't maybe require that one-on-one support, but it didn't mean they weren't getting accommodations and support in other ways. So it's nice to really understand their philosophy a bit and dig
mhm.
in and hear sort of what their priorities are. I hope that makes some sense.
Oh,
Um,
absolutely. Yeah, that makes
and
perfect sense.
and then there's camps that are centered around a certain disability or a certain kind of need. So there's camps that may like have a week of diabetes camp, and every camper has diabetes, and there are endocrinologists on staff and
Mm,
certain kinds of nurses and carb counts on everything, and they're supporting that need. I spoke at a conference a couple years ago, and it was like a cohort through American Camp Association, and it was I feel like the group is called like medical and disability needs camps or something. And so it was all different kinds of camps. But what was unique about this group is that every camp expected that every child there would have support needs, as opposed to a more general camp where they're supporting who needs support, if that makes sense. So sort of like the inclusion model versus like a more specialized model.
Got it. So let's say a parent has finally solidified with their kid which summer camp experience they're going to go to. What does the prep of that look like? Like, how do you recommend parents start, preparing their child for that experience? Maybe what are some important conversations to have with their kids before going?
So the one thing I noticed again and again when I worked in the camp world, and I'm still hearing it so much from camp professionals, is that kids tend to struggle in general, like kids these days, with just advocating for their needs, advocating when they're uncomfortable. I hear a lot of stories like, but mom, I did tell my counselor nothing happened. So last year, for the first time, I had the experience of being like the camp mom. I wasn't working at camp and I was sending my kids away because I worked at camp long enough that my kids went to that camp. And what I talked to them about, they each went to different programs, is okay, like the first person you talk to is your counselor. We had a discussion of like, what kinds of things should they be telling an adult? And if they don't feel like they're being heard, they're not seeing a change, they're still uncomfortable, who's the next person? And that looks different for each camp. Like, is it a supervisor? Is it a unit head? Sometimes it's just find an adult. Sometimes it can't even wait to figure out like who the next person is in line. But that sometimes you might have to, share your need more than once. But speaking up is really important. Our kids want to share things with us, and that's their norm. So they may go to school, they have a tough day, and like it's such a privilege. We're so blessed if they come home and share with us. But it's different when they're at overnight camp. And reminding them that if they write in the letter, I don't see it right away. So
Right.
I hope we talk about it when we get home, but I want you to trust the adults around you and tell them now what kinds of things like fit into that category. I find really important. And working with the way your child communicates, because sometimes that's a need in itself, that it's hard to talk to an adult for various reasons, or it's hard to express yourself verbally. What other ways can you assure that your child can communicate? Or do the staff know their signs for when things are not right if they're not communicating verbally?
That's huge. So I'm hearing, having conversations about self-advocacy, about trusting their own instincts and feeling like if and when they're not being heard, if they can find another person that they trust in a more authoritative manner at that camp.
Right.
And just having really honest conversations about your child's way in which they do communicate, and like you said, the signs and symptoms of maybe that not working as it should. That's brilliant. And those are things, that maybe we just don't overtly or explicitly think about all the time, but
right.
What deep and meaningful topics that we have to, and just very like metacognitive topics we have to engage with our kids in order to let them know and like give them an insight into who they are and how that reads.
Yeah.
Do you have, this is from the teacher standpoint in me, and probably you, especially what you were elementary, you said, right?
Right.
Are there any like conversation stems that you recommend using or choosing from as a parent? Like it would just be so cool to have like a list of a couple of things to start a conversation with a kid.
Yeah, I think just talking about it, like what are you excited about? What are you wondering about? Do you have any questions? And it's really individual. Like even in my own house, I have to approach it really differently for all three of my kids. I have one who gets really nervous, and I can't, I like want to start planning really early because they get nervous, so I get nervous. But I actually have to respect that, like, if I start talking about camp in January, like they might not go. It's like too overwhelming. So, like I have to sort of ask if they want to go and respect that. So I register them, but then I have to leave it alone for a while. until it becomes more real and meaningful. And then, the biggest piece of advice is that when, a kid says to you, like, I'm worried I'm going to be homesick or I'm going to miss you, I think that feels uncomfortable sometimes as parents because we don't want them to feel bad. So it's easy to dismiss it. You won't miss me. You're having too much fun, or like I'm boring, or whatever. Like it's just so natural. And I try to, with my kids, say, yeah, I get that. Like I'll miss you too. And you can still have a great time while you're missing me. I mean, that was my whole conversation I had with every kid who, ended up in my office before camp is, kids who loved camp but were scared to have that homesickness feeling again, was to reassure them that we can feel two things at once. It's normal and healthy to miss being home when you're coming from a wonderful home and you have great parents. And you can miss them the whole time and still have a good positive camp experience. And then we also talk about like what they can do if that feels overwhelming. So it's like, do you want to pack that special blanket or do you want pictures from home? Because some kids are all about it. Like they want, a little photo album to look at. And my son said, I don't want that. That's going to make me sad. So, everyone sort of has their different take on what's comforting. And also there's a good opportunity for, mention it to your counselor because they're trained on this. I mean, that's a big part of staff training. And we don't want our kids to have to, deal with that alone. Maybe no one else is outwardly homesick, so they feel like they're not supposed to be, but that doesn't mean they're not feeling that way.
Right. So acknowledging the feeling and supporting them, but also reframing it, maybe, like you said, right?
Yeah.
You can feel this way and have a good time.
Yeah. It can be both.
Yeah, it can be both. So I heard that piece of advice. Is there any, we only have two more questions really. The first of which, is there any other piece of advice you feel like you haven't mentioned yet that you might be useful for this conversation or this, experience in helping parents prep their kids or going to summer camp in general?
I think once you've decided your child's going to summer camp, it's always great to sort of revisit those self-care pieces to know what your camp expects. So if you pick a camp that everybody has support needs, maybe they're not expecting a lot of independence with those kinds of things, where some camps may be. So what do they expect of a fourth grader in terms of showering? Right? Is somebody going to turn the water on for them? Is somebody going to remind them to wash their hair? Are they going to wear bathing suits so somebody can wash their hair? And I've seen all different kinds of things, and we experimented with it too, like at our camp, because we obviously are going to be respectful of people's privacy, but also know that we had kids like going to second grade. So a lot of those kids are not, making sure the shampoo's coming out of their hair independently at home. And maybe if they're like the oldest child or whatever, for whatever reason, a parent might be doing like all of that for them. And it's a good time to think about, well, maybe that is what they need. And then I need to make sure the camp knows and can accommodate that. Or could I push a little bit and have my child work on some of those things at home? So I used to tell like the parents of our youngest kids, so try this now, like stand outside the shower or even outside the bathroom and prompt them. Okay, make sure your hair's wet, squeeze the shampoo into your hand, get the shampoo everywhere, rinse it out, and those kinds of things. And we always had counselors, standing outside of the showers, like checking hair to make sure there weren't suds in it and whatnot. So those are great questions to ask your camp. And then those are good things to start working on now. Certainly, like every camp should be giving lots of reminders, but they're not, necessarily like putting the toothpaste on the toothbrush. But maybe your child can't do that without some assistance. So that's something a camp needs to know.
Oh, absolutely. And even, there are moments like some of the things that you mentioned to me, I'm thinking, oh, I've done that for my kid. Oh, I do that for my kid, and it's like really taking a step back and having like, as a parent, this is like, look at, am I promoting as many independent skills as I can,
Sure.
or am I, I think that's a really important moment to have too, just depending on
And
what
we
your
all make
kid
those
needs and who they are.
right. And we have to make those decisions day by day, right? Like sometimes life
Right.
is busy and it's just faster to go in there and wash their hair. Fine, like no judgment here. But when
100%.
you know
I'm
they're
just
going
gonna
to
brush
camp,
your teeth for you, please.
totally, like that's okay. But really, in all reality, an 18-year-old staff member probably won't do that unless that
Right.
they know that the child that in their cabin does need that help and
Right.
someone's explained to them, because they might not know how to help a child brush their teeth, honestly. So
Exactly. Yeah.
it needs to be known and then they need to be trained.
Yeah, of course. So just self-advocacy and just communication with
Hmm.
what your kid needs, so on and so forth. This
Yeah,
has been so helpful. The comments that have come
good.
in, we've answered most of
Awesome.
them. And I have one last question really for you, and that is, do you have any other tools or resources for our community members to use while they shop and prepare for their child's summer camp experience that you haven't mentioned just yet?
Yeah, so I have a couple blogs on my website. I will start talking about camp now quite a lot, like on all my social media channels, giving little like pieces of advice, still like about how to shop camps and how to communicate with the camp. When we get closer to spring, like a lot of those endless health forums come out. So like what to make sure you're sharing, all of those good
Mm.
things. And then like how to even do the physical packing. Like I have a list on Amazon of like some of the products I like.
Oh, that's
Um,
great.
yeah, so there's definitely a lot of things. I have a little webinar I put together with it's called like Camp Prep for Parents, and I'll discount it as we get closer to camp, so it'll be really like inexpensive. It actually like shows me sitting on the floor with my duffel bags, some of the tricks I learned along the way, for like packing, which oh my god, can be so overwhelming as a parent.
Mm-hmm. I've seen a lot of those blogs that you've written previously. I'm happy to link those on our key takeaways, which and post in our
Awesome.
YouTube. And then if you don't mind, as you get closer and maybe as that webinar comes and more content is created, please share them with me and I will post those to our
Yeah.
socials. That way, we can increase that audience and they can get the help they need. That would be amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. And my email address is everywhere. I love talking shop. I love talking about camp, and it's nice in Michigan for sure to feel like think about summer sometimes in February. So anyone watching, like if you have a question about anything I ask, like please shoot me an email. I will I'm always happy to respond.
Well, we're so grateful you took the time, and this has been really insightful. I believe, I mean, even from
Good.
my experience too. So thank you so much for supporting our community, and
Yes.
um, I we're grateful, and we can't wait to get some more of those links so we can watch your webinar and watch you in your duffel bag, Marie
It's
Kondoing,
fun. Exactly.
all of the things probably. Well, thank you so much for the time, Frankie.
Thank
We're very
you.
grateful.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right.